Welcome to GeoHistory Files. Here, history isn't just remembered, it's investigated. Every empire, every war, and every political decision leaves a legacy that still shapes our world today. If you're new here, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Now, let's uncover the story they never wanted you to know. The complete history of the world in 20 minutes. The story of the world is not a story of progress. It is a story of forgetting. Every empire that ever ruled believed it would be the last. Every one of them was wrong. For most of the time humans have existed, there was no history at all. There were no cities, no kings, no borders. There were only small bands of people moving across an empty world, following the animals, watching the sky. This lasted for nearly 300,000 years. Almost everything that could be called human civilization fits into the final 4% of that time. The rest is silence. Then the ice retreated. The world grew warmer, and something changed in the soil of a few river valleys. People stopped following food and began to grow it. They planted seeds along the Tigris and the Euphrates in a land later called Mesopotamia. They stayed in one place, and staying in one place changed everything. Where there is stored grain, there is surplus. Where there is surplus, there is someone to guard it, count it, and take a share. The first cities rose from mud brick around 3500 BC. With them came writing, not for poetry, but for accounting. The oldest written words in the world are records of debt. From the beginning, civilization was about who owed what to whom. The Sumerians built the first true cities. Then came the Akkadians under Sargon, who conquered them all and built the first empire the world had ever seen. It stretched across the whole of the Fertile Plain. It seemed permanent. But this would not last. Drought came, the rivers thinned, the harvest failed, and the empire that had swallowed a dozen cities dissolved back into dust within a few generations. The pattern was set on the very first page: rise, expand, believe in permanence, fall. History would repeat this pattern for the next 5,000 years without ever seeming to learn it. To the west along the Nile, another civilization had already begun, and it would prove far more patient. Egypt was protected by deserts on both sides and a sea to the north. It was left alone to grow. Its pharaohs were not merely kings, but living gods, and they built to match that claim. The Great Pyramid rose around 2560 BC, over 2 million blocks of stone, each weighing more than a family. It would remain the tallest structure made by human hands for nearly 4,000 years. Egypt lasted longer than any empire that followed it. 3,000 years of kings, temples, and slow golden continuity. To the Egyptians, the world was eternal and unchanging, and for a very long time it was. Yet even the eternal empire aged. Its priests grew rich, while its pharaohs grew weak. Foreign peoples pressed in from every side. Egypt was conquered, freed, and conquered again, passing through the hands of the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, and finally the Romans, until the land of living gods became simply another province, its language forgotten, its writing unreadable for 2,000 years. While Egypt aged in the south, new powers were learning the crafts of war and trade around the Mediterranean. The Assyrians perfected cruelty as policy, ruling through terror and mass deportation. The Babylonians built hanging gardens and wrote down the first laws, carving into stone the idea that even a king must answer to something. And then, out of the highlands of Iran, came the largest empire the world had yet seen. The Persians under Cyrus and later Darius ruled from the Indus River to the shores of Greece. 40 million people, roads that ran for thousands of miles, a postal system so reliable that its motto still echoes today. Cyrus did not rule through terror alone. He let conquered peoples keep their gods and their customs. He understood something the Assyrians never had: that an empire held together only by fear is an empire always about to break. However, the Persians reached a wall they could not pass, and it was made of a few thousand stubborn men to the west. On the rocky peninsula of Greece, a scatter of small, quarrelsome city-states had done something strange. They had no emperor. In Athens, they gave power to the citizens themselves and called it democracy, ruled by the people, though the people were only free men, and the city ran on the labor of slaves. When Persia came to crush them, the Greeks did the impossible. They held. At Marathon, at Salamis, at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, they turned back the greatest empire on earth. Then, safe and proud, they turned on each other. Athens and Sparta fought a long and ruinous war that hollowed them both. Yet something had already begun to change. Far to the north, in a kingdom the Greeks had always dismissed as backward, Macedonia. Its young king was named Alexander. He was 20 when he took the throne and 25 when he had conquered the entire Persian Empire. By 30, his rule stretched from Greece to India, the largest empire the world had ever known, built in barely a decade. He was undefeated in every battle he ever fought. And then at 32, in the palace of Babylon, he died of a fever, or of poison, no one knows. He left no heir. His generals divided the world among themselves and spent the next 40 years destroying what he had built. This is the quiet lesson buried in Alexander's life. The greater the conquest, the more it depends on a single beating heart. When that heart stops, everything held together by it comes apart. Power built on one man dies with him. But the Greek world did not vanish. It dissolved into the lands it had conquered, spreading its language, its art, and its ideas across the East. And while the Greeks faded, a small city on the Italian coast was learning the same lessons and preparing to keep them. Rome began as almost nothing, a town on 7 hills, ruled by kings, then by its own citizens, who so hated the idea of a single ruler that they built an entire system to prevent one. For centuries, the Roman Republic conquered its neighbors, then Italy, then its great rival Carthage, across the sea, in wars so total that the losing city was burned to the ground and its very name erased. Rome grew until it ruled the whole Mediterranean, and in growing it destroyed the thing that had made it strong. The Republic could not govern an empire. Its generals grew richer than the state. Its politics turned to blood. One of those generals, Julius Caesar, crossed a small river called the Rubicon with his army, an act forbidden by law, and made himself master of Rome. He was murdered for it by men who wished to save the Republic. Their act killed it instead. From the ashes rose Caesar's heir, Augustus, who ended the wars and made himself the first emperor while pretending to restore the old freedom. He gave Rome peace, and Rome, exhausted, accepted the lie gladly. What followed was 2 centuries of stability across a quarter of the human race. Roads and aqueducts, law and coinage, a single system stretching from Britain to the desert. It was called the Roman peace, and to those who lived within it, it truly felt eternal. They could not imagine a world without Rome. No one ever can until it comes. However, the same weight that made Rome great slowly crushed it. The empire grew too large to defend. Its borders leaked, its currency thinned. Its emperors were made and murdered by their own armies, sometimes in the same year. Plagues swept through crowded cities and emptied them. And from beyond the frontier, pushed by other peoples, pushed by others still, the tribes of the north began to move. In 476 AD, a barbarian general removed the last emperor in the west, a boy, and did not bother to replace him. There was no great battle, no final stand. The empire that had ruled the world simply stopped, quietly like a fire that had run out of fuel. Most people alive at the time barely noticed. That is how empires usually end. Not with a scream, but with a shrug. The world that followed in the West was smaller, darker, and afraid. Cities shrank, trade withered. Knowledge that had taken centuries to gather was lost in a generation. But history does not stop when one civilization falls. It only moves. In the East, the Roman Empire lived on from the city of Constantinople for another 1,000 years, calling itself Roman until the very end. In the deserts of Arabia, a new faith was born in the 7th century, and within 100 years of its founder's death, the armies of Islam had conquered a stretch of the world larger than Rome at its height, from Spain to the borders of India. Under them, while Europe slept, the old Greek knowledge was preserved, translated, and multiplied. They advanced mathematics, medicine, and astronomy, while the cathedrals of the West were still made of wood. And farther east still, beyond the knowledge of any of them, another world had been rising for millennia. China had been a unified empire since 221 BC, when its first emperor joined the warring states into one and began the wall that would guard its northern edge. It rose and fell in long cycles of its own, dynasty after dynasty, each convinced it held the mandate of heaven, each eventually losing it to corruption, famine, and revolt. China invented paper, gunpowder, the compass, and printing centuries before the West. For most of recorded history, it was the richest and most advanced civilization on Earth. Yet the world was about to be joined together violently by the least likely people of all. From the open grasslands of Mongolia, a people with no cities and no writing united under one man, Genghis Khan. In a single lifetime, his horsemen built the largest connected land empire in all of history, stretching from the Pacific to the gates of Europe. They killed on a scale the world had never seen, entire cities emptied, millions dead, and yet along the roads they secured, goods and ideas and diseases flowed freely between East and West for the first time. One of those things that flowed was a plague. In the middle of the 14th century, it reached Europe and killed perhaps 1 in every 3 people alive there within a few years. The Black Death emptied villages, broke the old order of lords and peasants, and shook the faith of a continent. Out of that death came something unexpected. Labor grew scarce and valuable. The survivors questioned the old certainties. And in the cities of Italy, grown rich on trade, a rebirth of the ancient learning began. The world called it the Renaissance. But the deepest change came not from art, but from a hunger for gold and spices, and from ships. In 1492, a sailor crossed an ocean looking for Asia and found instead 2 continents that the rest of the world had never known existed. For the peoples already living there, who had built their own great empires, the Aztec and the Inca, it was the beginning of the end. They fell not mainly to swords, but to diseases carried unknowingly by the newcomers. Within a century, as much as 90% of them were dead. It was, by sheer number, the greatest catastrophe in human history, and almost no one at the time understood what had happened or why. From that meeting of worlds, a new kind of power emerged. Europe, once a poor and fractured corner of the map, now sat at the center of a web of trade that spanned the whole planet. Silver from the Americas, spices from the East, and, most darkly, human beings taken in chains from Africa and carried across the sea in their millions to work and die on distant plantations. The wealth of the modern world was built, in no small part, on this trade in stolen lives. And this new wealth changed how people thought. In the 17th and 18th centuries, thinkers began to argue that the world could be understood through reason, that kings ruled by consent rather than by God, that all men were born with rights no ruler could take away. These were dangerous ideas. In 1776, a set of colonies in North America declared themselves free in their name. In 1789, the people of France rose against their king, executed him, and tried to build a new world from nothing. The age of kings was ending. The age of nations and revolutions had begun. Then came the machines. In the mills of England, water and coal were harnessed to do the work of 1,000 hands. The steam engine, the factory, the railway, all appeared within a few short generations. For thousands of years, the fastest a message could travel was the speed of a horse. Now it moved at the speed of a wire. Human population, nearly flat for all of history, began to climb steeply and has never stopped since. This was the Industrial Revolution, and it changed human life more profoundly than anything since the first planted seed. The nations that industrialized first grew powerful beyond precedent. By 1900, a handful of European states and a rising Japan and America ruled or controlled nearly the entire world. A single small island, Britain, governed a quarter of the Earth's land and people. To those who lived at the center of it, progress seemed endless and inevitable. The 20th century, they believed, would be an age of reason and peace. However, the same industry that built the modern world had also learned to destroy it. In 1914, a web of alliances and ambitions dragged the great powers into a war none of them truly wanted. The machines they had built for making now turned to killing. Millions died in trenches over a few miles of mud. When it ended, 4 empires had collapsed, and the peace that followed was so bitter it merely set the stage for something worse. 20 years later, it came again, larger and darker. The Second World War killed perhaps 70 million people. It saw the deliberate industrial murder of millions in the death camps of Nazi Germany, an evil so vast the world needed a new word for it. And it ended with 2 flashes of light over 2 Japanese cities, as humanity learned, for the first time, that it now held the power to destroy itself entirely. From the ruins, two giants rose to face each other, the United States and the Soviet Union. For 40 years, they never fought directly because to do so would have ended everything. Instead, they built weapons enough to erase all human life many times over and pointed them across the world, waiting. It was called the Cold War, a peace held together not by trust but by mutual terror. The whole of human history had led to a single, unbearable fact. The species that began by planting seeds along a river could now, in an afternoon, undo 300,000 years of its own existence. That war ended not with fire, but, once again, with a shrug. In 1991, the Soviet Union simply dissolved, its economy exhausted, its people no longer believing. One of the two giants had fallen without a shot, and for a brief moment it seemed that history itself had ended, that liberal democracy had won, and that the long story of rise and fall was finally over. But this too would not last. It never does. New powers rose, old rivalries returned, and the same patterns that had governed the Akkadians and the Romans reasserted themselves in new forms. The tools grew more powerful. The story stayed the same, and this is the thread that runs through all of it, from the first mud brick city to the last nuclear silo. Every civilization believed it was the exception. Every one of them believed that its order was the natural and final state of things, that what it had built would endure. The Egyptians believed it for 3,000 years. The Romans believed it. The empires of the 20th century believed it. Each of them was, for a time, the whole world, and each of them passed. Power is never held. It is only borrowed. It moves from hand to hand across the centuries, and no hand has ever held it for long. The cities beneath the sand were once the center of everything. The languages no one can read were once spoken by millions who were certain they would be remembered. The world does not end. It only turns. And those who live at the height of any age, certain that their moment is permanent, are simply the latest in a line that stretches back to the first harvest and forward past anything now living can see. That is the complete history of the world. Not a march toward a destination, a wheel, turning, always in the dark.